Hello, Kelly. How are you?
I am excellent. I'm good. I'm so excited for March to be here.
And why? It's because, hang on.
Well, because it's my birthday month.
Oh,
Also, the
interesting.
month of March Madness for basketball. I love that. I'm a big, college basketball just fanatic. And it's also the birthday of my big hero in life, Albert Einstein. So,
Well, there you go. Okay, well, thank you for sharing all that because I wouldn't have known any of those things. So
yeah,
happy birthday month and
thank you.
March Madness. I do know because, my husband is like nonstop on
Yeah.
basketball, but and I can't even be upset about it because it just doesn't, it's like fine, fine. So, but anyway, so let's get started. What's your topic for today?
Well, today I want to talk about recovery in both addiction and for trauma because
Oh,
trauma is so connected to addiction. And most people who are going through addiction recovery also have trauma healing that they're trying to work through as well. And a lot of people think, well, I just heal from them both at the same time. And while you heal from them both at the same time, not in the same capacity or in the same way, at all. And I think that was one of the most difficult and complex parts of my healing was learning to separate them both, but not only to, but understanding why. Because if you can't understand the why, it had me caught up for several months. And I think the reason to start with, one of the biggest things is that most people who struggle with addiction of any kind have experienced some type of trauma from their childhood. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, that I'm saying everyone was sexually abused. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse. It could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. A lot of things that people think are not trauma are actually trauma. And I think that's one of the important things that people have to begin to comprehend is that trauma is based on your interpretation of the event. And so a lot of people say, oh, I've never had any trauma. And then they start telling me about their childhood. I'm like, that's traumatic. And that's traumatic. And that's really traumatic. And so some examples of some of those things can be, you could lose a parent. You could lose a parent to death early in childhood. That's very traumatic. You could witness domestic violence or witness violence anywhere. It doesn't have to even be in your own home. If you grew up in a neighborhood that there was a lot of violence, I had one of my life coaching clients tell me, well, I was 7 and a drive-by shooting happened while I was outside. But other than that, I had no trauma. And it was the people right next door, and 2 or 3 people were killed. And, this child's laying flat on the ground, but saying, oh, I didn't really have any trauma. That's very traumatic. And your neighbors were murdered. And so there's all kinds of trauma. It doesn't mean you had bad parents. It doesn't mean that you had a horrific childhood, but trauma is just so many different faces. And I think people don't recognize it. So they're quick to say, I don't have trauma. And so to understand, a divorce can be traumatic. A divorce of your parents can be very trauma inducing. And I think the thing is, people look at trauma and there's like stigma to unhealed trauma because society tends to look at people, oh, you haven't healed from that, you must be weak. Or we think that we have our own perception of unhealed trauma. Why haven't I let this go? Because in spite of what Frozen says, one does not let it go. It just doesn't work that way. And so understanding that there are different types of trauma, and I think I'm trying to remember the exact number, it's 2/3, I think, of all people who struggle with addiction had some type of childhood trauma. And 2/3, I would venture to guess it's even more than that. But so many people don't realize that a lot of what they went through truly was trauma, even though they can't think of it. If you sat and you questioned them, then maybe they would say, oh, well, I did have that. I just didn't realize that was trauma. And, the other thing is ACEs, which is the adverse childhood experiences that people experience. Also, there's a high correlation between ACEs in our childhood and addiction. And a lot of people, same thing, whether you're witnessing violence or whether you've experienced it in your own home, or it could be grief, loss, a car accident. One lady said to me, well, I lost my mom in a car accident, but I never had any trauma. That's very traumatic. And, and plus you witness all the people around you and their grief and their trauma. And so to understand that most of us have had some type of trauma, and that when we have trauma or we have those ACEs in our life, those situations produce an elevated vulnerability to addiction. And why? We all know there's the biological component to addiction that already creates a weakness in us, perhaps. But those traumatic events also cause that increased vulnerability to addiction. And so understanding those and the behavioral issues that come with it, because there's also the behavioral addictions, whether it's sex or gambling or shopping, equally as destructive. And those, especially compulsive overeating, is very related to sexual abuse in childhood. The numbers are just astronomical. And so once we get into treatment for our addiction, and then we say, well, I don't really have trauma. I didn't have trauma. And then once we understand we did have trauma, here's the part where that gets kind of, hazy for a lot of people, because in 12-step programs, what are we taught? We're taught we're powerless to this addiction. We're powerless to this substance. And we have to take responsibility for the things we've done wrong. But in trauma healing, we're taught that we were powerless to our abusers, and that we need to gain power today, and we don't have to be powerless to anything. And we're taught that the responsibility was completely and totally the perpetrator, not us. And so we have two very different outlooks and approaches. We're being told, okay, you take responsibility for what you've done wrong, take responsibility for this addiction. But then we're being told this abuse wasn't your fault, and you were powerless to it, but you're not powerless anymore to anything. But we're being told you're powerless to this substance. And it may sound like that's easy to separate the two, but it isn't when you're in the beginning of healing. When you're in the beginning of recovery and sobriety, for me, I desperately wanted to take responsibility for the mistakes I made and the blur of all of my addictions. I wanted to do that. I needed to do that. But then in treatment for my sexual abuse, I was constantly being reminded this was not your fault. And this abuse is what caused these addictions. So in my mind, I had moments where I thought, well, if the abuse caused my addictions, then how are the mistakes I made during addiction my fault? Everyone in the world should understand it. That it's easy to go down that path for a little while, especially in the beginning of healing. But luckily, I was blessed with a really, really excellent therapist who was like, that might be like the easy path to take, but that's not the one we're going to take, because even though your trauma was the catalyst for your addictions, you're still 100% responsible for the mistakes you made and for that addiction. And I can tell you for sure, the court doesn't care. The court doesn't want to hear, oh, I was traumatized as a child, because if you just think about it, probably every person who steps in front of a judge was traumatized as a child. So we would have no one in the court if trauma erased our mistakes, but it just doesn't. And so what I had to come to really make peace with was, okay, I have my trauma and I have my addiction, but I have to heal them both separately, but concurrently. And I had to be able to put them into two concrete separate piles. One contributed to the other, but they were both separate entities. And I had to heal them both differently. And imagine what a difficult place that is for people who are trying to heal from sexual abuse, because when you are powerless to that kind of abuse, then what happens? Your self-esteem, your self-worth, it all suffers. It all gets pulled down, and your worth is just basically zero. So you're trying to heal and rebuild those things, but at the same time, I'm this person who made these mistakes. I'm this person who did all of these things with my addiction. And so it hits you hard when you initially, until you can understand that you really have to look at them as two separate issues. And while one may have caused or contributed or been the catalyst for the other, it's still, you have to heal them separately. And I think the big thing about that is there are so many myths about trauma. And the four biggest myths about trauma, the first one is that time heals all wounds. And oh my, sorry if you hear that, people going by outside with, if we can hear it on the webinar, how loud is it in their car? But the first, sorry guys. So anyway, the first myth is that time heals all wounds, and time doesn't heal anything. It doesn't. People like to think that, but it does take time to heal, but time doesn't heal anything on its own. And so we have to be able to understand that even if it's been 50 years, the things we went through that we haven't addressed yet are going to be there waiting on us and saying, hey, over here, until you address me, I'm going to keep rattling my chains in the attic of your heart, and you're going to keep reaching for things to try to silence me. The second one is that physical and sexual abuse is the only trauma that can lead to addiction. And that's just not true. Like we spoke of earlier, all those different kinds of trauma can lead to addiction. Even, and people might be thinking, well, so I went through a rough divorce with my parents. The key to understanding is that trauma is about your perception of the event. And so what trauma, like you could have siblings, this is a big one I get with my clients, that they say, well, my brothers and sisters went through it just fine. I'm the only one who was traumatized by it. Well, maybe you were a different age. You're a different person. You have different genes. You have different DNA. And what hurts them may not hurt you. And so there's so many different components to that, whether it's your resiliency or whatever you have, that what isn't traumatic for them may be very traumatic for you. And so understanding that trauma is what your perception of the event was and how it affected you. Doesn't matter how it affected anybody else. It's how it affected you. And that's what's important. And any therapist worth more than a penny will help you work through that. Because I mean, we all know, of course, there are some out there who don't understand trauma and yet they're treating it. And so if you have someone who doesn't understand that your trauma is about what is significant to you and what mattered to you, then that's the person you want to work through that with. And a third one is that people think past traumas don't affect our lives today. That I have a lady who's 84 and she said, well, possibly, Kelley, what happened when I was 8, can it affect me today? Yes. 100%, especially if you haven't processed through it and you don't think it can. But so much of how we deal with everything is dictated by how our brain formed when we were in those developmental stages in childhood. And we just don't realize it. We think, well, I've pushed it away for 80 years. How is it still affecting me? It 100% is affecting you. And learning to, the first thing is learning to grasp it and say, maybe there is trauma I haven't worked through. I have clients who have been raped and they've really processed that and worked through that, but they never worked through these other traumas that they experienced as children that they didn't realize were traumatic. And so really looking at your life and saying, this is the course of my life. Make a life map. And, you know, I always tell people, draw me the crossroads on your life map. What were big events? What were events that you remember? What were the painful ones? What, when you think back, what makes you cry when you think about that in childhood? Or if someone else says, oh, I had this amazing childhood, right away, you're drawn to that memory. Why? Because there's something about it that's powerful in your psyche and something that's really pushing something in you. So making a roadmap of your life and doing early childhood, middle childhood, late childhood, then adolescence, then early teen, and then late teen years, and really put what the crossroads were. What were the things that hurt in that time? What were the things that bring you to tears still when you remember it? Because those are powerful. And maybe you need some work through some of those that will only help more with your sobriety and your recovery, because those are the things that cause us to break down and feel like we can't handle things and feel stressed and overwhelmed by life in general. So it's working through each one of those helps us more in our everyday life to not reach for something that we really don't want to reach for. And the fourth myth is that a traumatic event occurred exactly the way we remember it. And, you know, and so I'll tell you how this comes into play, because I have a client who there was abuse in her family with her and her sisters. And her sisters tell her that's never the way it happened. It didn't happen that way. It happened like this. And a lot of times our memory will remember things differently than how they actually occurred. But again, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. That made this person who I work with feel like, well, I guess it didn't happen because I remembered it wrong. So they think I'm lying, and it doesn't mean you're lying. Our memory changes things and time distorts some things, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just because you have some details wrong or inaccurate doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And again, that's where, was it traumatic to you? If it's traumatic to you, whether you have details exactly right or not, all the time, people who are taking police reports, as time passes, they remember things differently. And that's part of trauma. That's just part of what can happen, that we remember some things differently. And, but that doesn't mean the trauma didn't occur. It doesn't mean it wasn't real or genuine. And so again, what is really, really sticking in your mind and what's hurting you and controlling you is the things you have to work on. And don't let other people who are saying to you, oh, that's not the way it happened. You need to silence people who want to speak on your trauma, because your trauma is personal and it relates to you. And so being able to look at the trauma and the addiction as these two separate entities is so important. Being able to say, I'm in a 12-step program, and I understand that the components of that program are different than my healing from whatever type of abuse I've been through. And so many people struggle and think, well, it was emotional abuse. Or, it was when I was 5 or 6 and it's not today. But other people see you and they think, well, there's nothing wrong. I spoke at an event 2 weeks ago, and I said, from the outside, I looked like I had everything just fine. And this is why, if people can't see a bruise or a wound or a scar, they tend to think you were never in a fight. They think no battle happened. And the thing is, it's all those internal wounds that healed 40 years ago, even though they healed in a very, very unhealthy manner. Those are the things that are still with us internally. And just because people can't see it doesn't mean it didn't occur. And so and that's another reason too why we have to work so hard on not being judgmental of other people, because we don't know what they're going through. We have no idea what's happened in their lifetime, no matter how they present. They can present, think of mean women at work. We've all worked with them. And I have people who say, I've never been a mean woman at work. I've never talked about someone else. And I said, well, did somebody ever walk by and you looked at your coworker and you were like, that's a bullying behavior, no matter what. I mean, even though you're not speaking words, those behaviors, healthy people don't have to talk about other people. Healthy people don't have to put other people down. Healthy people don't have to point out other people's, shortcomings. And so I try to always look at people and say, it doesn't matter what they're presenting on the outside. Just like no one knew my trauma, I don't know that person's trauma. So if they're having a bad day, they're having a bad day. Maybe they're having a bad life. I mean, I said to someone last week, maybe that person's having a bad day. She said, well, he must be having a bad life because he's like that every day. And maybe, but who knows what he hasn't healed from, that we can't see his scars. In the Bible, people tore their clothes when they were hurting. In the Old Testament, when I first started studying the Bible, I asked my pastor, why is everybody ripping their clothes? And he said, it's a sign of grief. If something hurt them, they tore their clothes, and that let everyone else know, hey, I'm hurting. And wouldn't it be nice today if we could do that? If you just see a little rip on somebody's clothes, and you're like, oh, give them a break. They're going through something. But we don't have that. But knowing that is, I think, something that can allow us to be a lot more forgiving for the things we don't know, for the things we just don't know. The other day, the UPS driver came to our house, pounded on the door like he was trying to break it down. And we hadn't even gotten to the door yet, threw the package on the ground and just stomped back to his truck. You could just tell he was mad at the entire world. And I said to my son, wow, he must be going through something. I said, we don't know what he's going through. His mom could be dying. His wife could be leaving. Who knows what that man's going through? Just let it go and give him a pass. And I think if more people could have that attitude towards the people they don't know or the people they do know, but the closest people to me didn't know my trauma. My very best friends didn't know my trauma. My boyfriend didn't know my trauma. No one knew my trauma. So I think that it's a big healing step to be able to give ourselves grace, but also give grace to other people as well. So in that whole healing cycle, being able to say, there are things I'm not going to understand in my healing journey. And I think that's how I pulled the two together was, here's my trauma, here's my addictions, here's my 12-step program. And they don't go together. They don't mesh together like this. Many times they're like this. And having to be able to understand, I surrender it. I just had to surrender it. I had to say, whether you're a person who believes in God or the universe or whatever, I had to be able to say, I just surrender this. I accept and understand there will always be things I don't understand. And trying to understand everything will make me lose my mind. For me, I give it to God. And, in the 12-step programs, we surrender. And I think that's so crucial when you're healing from trauma and recovery, because if either one isn't going to serve you well, you're not going to make your best progress if you don't heal from both. So you can be sober, but not have healed your trauma, and it's still going to be like this. Something's going to go wrong. Or you can heal from your trauma, but still be doing whatever with your addictions. And you have to do them both simultaneously. You have to work on them both at the same time. And if there's someone you love going through that, understand they're trying to heal them both at the same time. And it's not an easy journey. I mean, people think, okay, well, that covers it and that's simple, that's what I'll do. But it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly hard to go back and pick through the things that hurt you, pick through the things that traumatized you, because you have to work through those feelings. The only way you heal something is to feel it. And going through that is difficult. You don't in one day go through the story of your life and say, healed. It's just not the way it works. And so developing patience for yourself, patience for the people you love who are also going through it, I think is just a crucial step. We just have to understand that we'll never understand anything. Trauma doesn't go away on its own, and neither does addiction. So we need people, we need healing in both areas, and to understand how the two come together, that one definitely is a catalyst for the other, but we have to heal from them separately, but simultaneously is the key. And really being able to give ourselves time and just patience and grace to do it, because so many people are so hard on themselves. Oh my gosh, I'm just a loser. I did this again. I'm a mess. I'll never get it right. But you would never say that to your best friend. If your best friend said, oh, this was what happened last night, you would never say, you loser, you're never going to get it right. You just wouldn't do that. And so we have to learn to talk to ourselves the same way we talk to our friends, and but understanding it, I think, gives people such a better chance to heal and move forward. Really understanding that you're trying to heal from something that's most likely been decades and decades in your life. And you're not going to get it perfect. None of us are going to get it perfect, but what we water is what grows. So that's pretty much what I had for today for that. It's a lot though.
It is a lot. And honestly, I've been around a while, but I had never really thought about the paradox of, trauma. Like, it isn't your responsibility. It isn't your fault. But in addiction, you need to take responsibility. And it is really a paradox. And at this point, I can understand it and agree. And I think, the trauma, I love the idea of the roadmap. I think being in a supportive community, having a professional helping guide you, because trauma, it comes up, and like you said, you have to feel it, and that is so relapse prone. So making sure that you've got the support in place to be able to to weather the feelings.
Yes.
And I love what you just said about, your best friend wouldn't say that to you. And I thought, man, if I've got those negative voices going through my head, if I said, what would my best friend say to me right now? The message would change. That's a really practical thing for me to apply, is like, what would my best friend say to me in this moment? And it wouldn't be the shaming, oh, you're so horrible, you're an idiot. It would be, oh, that had to hurt, that, whatever. Um, when you're talking about the old wounds too, so I mentioned Enid Gray, who's going to do the Super Saturday Recovery Summit. Her book, Neglect the Silent Abuser, like all of those things that you talked about, the grief, the loss, the abandonment, it's neglect. And it isn't even like, the horrible neglect. It can be your parents didn't have the bandwidth because they were mentally, and they were struggling with addiction or mental illness, or there was, there was a sibling or somebody who needed, extra care, so resources were diverted there and there just wasn't bandwidth. And what you're talking about with siblings too, and how even though you're in a similar environment, your reactions and how you process, whether it's resiliency or age, or it's somebody had more support than someone else, or I mean there's so many different factors. But again, if we could use the best friend voice and go, that's just how it is, so here's where we are now, how do we process through it. But I've long said too, with wounds, when you have a deep wound, they do wound care. They go in and they do deep wound care, because if they just slap a Band-Aid on it, you're going to have infection through your entire body. And so you can't just toss this stuff up in the closet and go, oh yeah, that was no big deal. It's going to fester. And so we have to process through that. And for me, it was really in layers. It was like more things were revealed as I was able to take care of probably the big T. We talk about big T trauma and little T trauma. So as some of those big T things, then it's the peeling back layers, but I had somebody, when you're also talking about the what someone's experiences of it. I was in a conversation with somebody and witnessed how a conversation went down, and I saw somebody being traumatized, and what was said wasn't traumatizing. I mean, it wasn't, the language wasn't unkind or anything, but this person absolutely pick through things, and I could tell that it was banging into old wounds. And so this person's experience was completely different than the reality I experienced in the in the conversation. And that doesn't take away that person's reality of that was traumatizing.
Right, because it's all about our filter, and everything that we have passes through our filter. Maybe I'll do filter for next month, because I have a really good exercise that I do that really, really helps people understand our filter. But yes, I mean, we have, I have the Binge Free Babes group with Dr. Nina. And at the end of our last session, we said we had every single person in the group say by themselves, I'm a survivor and I am powerful. Whatever you've survived, because we've all survived something. And being able to, when our progress seems very small and tiny little increments, it's easy to get, disappointed with that. But being able to look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a survivor and I'm powerful. Just the fact I got up and got out of bed today makes me powerful, like I am a warrior and I'm a survivor. And I think that it's important for people to remember that, because I talked last time about that identification with the aggressor. We tend to start thinking, oh, that's the whole reason we did that, because it gave us hope to escape abuse. And so, I have a client who was in a car crash with her sister and her brother and cousin and mom, and the cousin was killed. The sister had no problem with it. She was like, I don't know why she can't get over it. Because you're different people, and different people can experience the exact same event. One person will be traumatized and one person won't. And it doesn't mean that anything is wrong with either one of those people. Some people could be like, oh, she's terrible. She must be a hard, cold person. It didn't traumatize her. Well, her resiliency is different, and her life stage was in a different place. Her development was in a different place. And so it's all about how it feels to us and how we internalize it. And that's really, really, I mean, Tammy, my story. And while I was trying to deal with addiction, recovery from trauma, and a really difficult legal case, I had all of this coming down. And so that's why it was so important to me to understand trauma and to really start studying it. And by the way, this summer, I'm starting in a PhD program on trauma. So I'm very excited for that because it's just, I have a master's degree in clinical counseling, but this trauma has just really, really gets if I find an article on trauma, see you 2 hours later because I'm going to be reading every bit of it. So just saw a tail
I
go
see.
by.
Yeah, I saw it.
So do we have questions?
We do. So the first one is, I'm trying to deal with childhood trauma from being the stepchild of a sex addict and watching him and my mom's drama played out publicly. How can I do more to heal as a betrayed partner who's been married for 3 decades to a sex addict who's now in recovery several years, although he secretly acted out throughout our entire relationship?
So let me pull up this question.
Yeah. So was
Yeah.
the stepchild of a sex addict and watched all the drama as a child, and then has been married to, is a betrayed partner with someone who has been is in recovery now, but has acted out secretly throughout their relationship.
And no wonder that she ended up married to someone who was just like what she grew up with, right? Because we're trying to heal that past trauma and we pick people to try to heal it through. If I can marry someone who has this same issue, and even if you didn't realize it when you married them, and I can work it out with them, then we think that we can heal that childhood trauma. And so my advice for that would be, first of all, I'm really sorry for everything that you've gone through and continue to go through, because I know that's not an easy path to walk. And, you're very courageous and brave to stay in this relationship and to fight for it. Certainly anybody would understand if you left. And I'm deeply sorry for that pain. And I just am over here applauding you because I know you've gone through a lot, you've experienced a lot of pain. I think the important thing is to realize that you need healing absolutely as much as your partner does. And they don't say here if whether or not they went into treatment for everything they experienced because of their childhood with their parents and their step parent. But it's easy to get caught up in our partner's healing journey and forget that we have one too, because maybe we're not acting out, but they are. And so your healing is every bit as important as your partner's, because you're experiencing continued trauma every time your partner acts out, every time your partner slips up. You're having more trauma that's only adding layers and layers, like Tammy talked about, layers of trauma on top of other trauma. And so then there's more of a pile for you to work through because you're supporting this person. So I think it's just really crucial for you to continue to be in intensive treatment yourself to deal with everything you're going through, because there's so much betrayal in that. There's so much betrayal. And so that's what I would really strongly recommend, is every possible way. I mean, you're on here now, so that says something, but every possible way you can to continue to let your soul heal, because you're healing.
Yeah. Somebody popped in the chat, that sounds like codependency. This is not codependency. We do not ascribe to codependency. I think it's more like you have a tolerance for chaos. If you've lived in that chaos all those years. I read the publicly and I thought, oh my gosh. So this feels like it wasn't just in the home. It was like everybody knew. Dr. Rob has talked about that, where his mother was the one that was running down the street naked. And so like everybody in the neighborhood knew, that his mom was mentally ill. And, in that time it was, she's crazy, and so I feel for, the level. I appreciate what Kelley's talking about is, getting support and therapy to heal your constant trauma, and how difficult it has to be. Yes, he's in recovery now, but I'm also thinking that, the betrayal for the entire relationship, and understanding and processing that, like there were so many lies. I think it's incredibly difficult for partners, but they, they can figure it out, because it feels like, oh, everything that was a lie, and it isn't. There were some truths in there, and your person loved you, and all of that. But figuring that all out, parsing that all out, really does take support and help. But no, we are very codependent
I was going
aligned.
to say that.
So
We
yeah,
are
yeah.
codependent. We are codependent in this place. Read the book.
Right, right, right. Yeah, no one is sick for loving an addict. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I just, I honor, that I always go to, wow, what a resilient person, because you weathered the storm of the chaos of your childhood, and a long-term relationship with somebody who like there was probably some sense of I mean, I hear all the time from partners who have physical ailments, like the chronic like, I don't even know, autoimmune type things or whatever, because I like their body like senses all this stuff, even though the addict is gaslighting them and telling them, no, 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 I'm all good. So I can only appreciate that, your resiliency for, sticking through all of that, and here you are,
Mhm.
so good for you.
And
So
probably also this person is probably, I mean, I'm certain at this point, nothing stays secret forever. So there's embarrassment and humiliation with it as well. Like you said, there's so many layers of pain there. And yet
yeah.
haven't chosen to say, I'm done with you, and that in itself speaks about loyalty and love and the whole codependent model. We can love someone who's struggling, but we have to be able to insulate ourselves to that pain. And that is what her own, or I shouldn't say her, I don't know. That's what that person's healing needs to really focus on, is how do I support and stay, if that's what I choose to do, and not allow myself to be destroyed by it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really glad, that he's in recovery. I mean, that always is such a hope. There are so many people that never get recovery. So
Right.
so
Oh,
there is a lot of hope in all of this. So okay, so next question. Any strategies in dealing with certain dates that come up? Oh wow, yeah, about my trauma. March 10th was the day my husband went missing and passed away on the way to the hospital. Oh, um, yeah.
yeah. I think, we all know that dates are triggers. They're triggers for trauma and can just send us spiraling. And I think we have to be able to anticipate our triggers. That's a huge piece of healing, is knowing, okay, these dates are coming. These dates are big triggers for me. What are my grounding techniques? What are my coping skills, healthy ones that I can use? What is my circle of support? Who can I lean on, so that on those days that are incredibly difficult, whatever works best for you. Some people want to be alone. Some people want to be alone and have solitude and feel what they're feeling in solitude. Other people want to have people around them. But I think anytime you're talking about triggers, and that's what dates are, triggers, you have to be able to deal with them, if you can, in advance, and knowing they're coming, being prepared. That's what thought stopping techniques are about. That's what grounding techniques are about, so that you don't allow yourself to completely spiral into a full blown emotional just upheaval, to where it lasts for days and days, and it turns into weeks. And the next thing you know, the unthinkable is happening again, and you're back to square one. So I think you have to prepare. You have to prepare. If I go somewhere that I know, okay, if I attend this event, I always know there are going to be speakers talking about something that's a trigger for me. Me talking about something is one thing. Hearing someone else talk about it might trigger me. And so I know these are the things I do, these are the steps I take, and this is how I handle that, because I know it's coming. And so knowing those dates are coming and having a really good game plan for how am I going to deal with those dates? How am I going to deal with the day before? I know when it comes to Mother's Day, and losing my mom was a very, very painful thing for me. And I lost her, I think, relatively young. Seeing all the Mother's Day presents, seeing all the Mother's Day cards, seeing all those things that I used to look for her is incredibly painful. So I have trained myself, okay, on the week of Mother's Day, I'm doing the click list, I'm picking up, for those few weeks so that I don't have to deal with seeing all those items, or I don't even go to that part of the store. The best offense is a good defense, and you have to prepare.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, and give yourself grace because it's not just March 10th. It's going to be March 11th too. So that there's, I mean, yes, the date, but some of the shadows can continue to follow you. So, if there is something that is meaningful for you to engage with on March 10th, if looking at photos, or I mean, if there's something positive that or meaningful, being with other people. I'm a people person, so like to me, being with other people is hugely helpful in connecting. So glad you're here. There's stuff on March 10th. Join us. So
Right, for sure.
okay. So it's very traumatic to lose both parents before they were 70. How do I deal with their major loss? You were just kind of mentioning, the loss of your mom.
Yeah. Yeah. And this isn't therapeutic. This is just personal for me. What I always try to remind myself when I'm dealing with loss that's a death loss is, especially if someone I dearly, dearly loved. Like I said, this isn't treatment, but this is just personally, I try to say, I'm very lucky that I had someone who I loved that much, especially a parent, because a lot of people didn't get that in their life. And so I would rather deal with the grief of losing them than to have never loved them. And, that's such a gift. But heartbreak is heartbreak. And we still miss the people we love, no matter how much faith we have. We still miss them. We love them. We've lost them. And so I think all of the same things, we just deal with it as best as we can. We try to prepare for it coming up. And that's how trauma is. As the date gets closer, there was a traumatic event in my life, and I would think, oh, well, at this time, I still didn't know that was coming. At this time, my life still seemed normal because that hadn't happened yet. And so that's what trauma does. It causes us to live in increments like that, and being able to say, that I have a way of dealing with this, I have a plan, and this is what I do, helps us to start to allow that to diffuse a little bit.
Sorry. Sending that. Okay. So next question. What does working through trauma look like besides establishing a roadmap? And if you've gone through the pain but not healed, can you go on and heal without more pain since you already went through all that pain? I also like how you said not to talk to ourselves negatively, but instead talk to ourselves like we would be our best friend. I would also apply that to our family members. So let's talk about, how do we process through trauma?
Right. And, everybody processes and heals from trauma in their own way. But what I encourage all of my clients to remember is that you survive the trauma, you'll survive healing from it. And it doesn't feel like that sometimes. But the question where they said, can you go on and heal without more pain since you already went through all that pain? I think healing is painful. But I can tell you not healing is more painful. And because healing is painful, but it's a limited pain. Never healing is going to be with you for the rest of your life. So being able to work through it, and other than just, she said, or he, I don't know if it was Chuck or Bridget. So said, what's it look like besides establishing a roadmap? For me, of course, I had intense therapy that I went through because even though I was a therapist myself, I can't heal myself. And so I went through, it's Bridget. Okay. Hi, Bridget. So even though I went through, treatment, very intensive treatment, I had to utilize the different healing techniques that go with, for me, it's PTSD. And so the different, like I just spoke about, the grounding techniques and the thought stopping techniques and what to do with night terrors and how to process all of that and how to get the flashbacks and those intrusive thoughts and the terrors to stop, to get them to, because when I first started working through it, it was like a giant portal had been opened and I was just overwhelmed with it all. And, those are things that a therapist can help you work through. of course, I mean, I love to read. I'm an avid reader. So I read every possible book I could get my hands on, whether it was faith related or whether it was healing related or whatever. And I journaled a lot, and I made healing contracts with myself that I would be easy and gentle on myself and compassionate with myself, because there will always be the people who want to throw your pain in your face or throw your mistakes in your face. And I just posted on social media yesterday a picture. It was outside a church, and it said, people throwing their mistakes in your face is like trying to rob the house I used to live in. I don't live there anymore,
Mm-hmm.
And but being able to work through all of those things, I wish there was a magic formula I could give you to heal, but there just simply isn't. And what works for one person may not work for another. But also having support that you can utilize, whether it's support groups, and there are so many support groups online, so many support groups that are free, that you don't even have to attend in person, that you can do it virtually. Or I don't know if anybody on here is in the Clubhouse. It's a new social media that it's not video, it's all on your phone and you listen. And we do a group, Dr. Nina and I, every week in Clubhouse. And it's just people come into your room and they listen to the conversation you're having. And then they can talk if they want to, they raise their hand to talk or whatever, and you can let them talk. And so but it's really great for support for people who just really want to, a lot of people are uncomfortable with virtual healing. A lot of people are uncomfortable, or virtual support groups where people can see them if they talk. And so it gives a different avenue for that. But I would just really, there's no way to heal without it hurting. I mean, I think if you have surgery, it hurts to recover, but eventually it gets better. And it's the same way. You don't want to carry it with you forever. So I would like to tell you healing's not painful, but that would not be truthful. And so I think that we deal better when we know what to expect. And just like Tammy said earlier, we put a Band-Aid over our trauma, and most of those Band-Aids weren't healthy ones. So when we go into treatment, we rip off the Band-Aid, we got that wound. And so we have to go in and clean it out and work through everything that was underneath there before it heals. And we don't need a Band-Aid anymore. And that's what addiction is. Every addiction is a different Band-Aid.
Yeah, and there are trauma modalities. So here's some practical resources. So EMDR, and it's eye movement rapid desensitization or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, it's the tapping, and you can do it even if you're working via Zoom with a professional. But it's different points, and part of it, which I love, and obviously my therapist does it with me, is that not only are you taking out the negative reaction, but you're inserting a positive one. Like there's a positive message that replaces it. I mean, like even recently, I saw my therapist not too long ago, and like unbeknownst to me, all of a sudden I'm crying while she's having me do a little EMDR, and it's a good cry. It's just, tears dripping, but I've gone through some major painful healing. But it was just like I was talking about with Kelley. It's like, some stuff that was really deep in, and I wasn't even really aware of what it was going on, and was able to get at some of that, and the freedom of not carrying that around was huge. And so somatic experience, there are a number of modalities of trauma healing. There's also trauma support on intherooms.com, and Kelley's been a guest on Super Saturday Recovery Summit before, but there's several trauma groups, and they're free, just like everything on In the Rooms is free. There's trauma groups, there's grief groups, and I would invite you, to check them out, see what's a fit for you, on your journey. But I think that those are really important, to acknowledge. It's so easy to acknowledge, like we were talking about. It's like, nobody thinks that they have trauma, and because you grew up in it, and that's just how things were. Like the person earlier was talking about, I was a stepchild in this house. This is what I grew up in. So it's very normalized, even if it's not normal, it's normalized, and normal's the wrong word, but it's like you just accept that this is how it is. And I've had so many people say, well, I thought everybody had that, and it isn't necessarily. So getting support and getting help is really critical. But know that there is support and help, and there's different modalities. And like Kelley was talking about too, any therapist that's worth their salt, can, if they don't do EMDR, they'll point you to it. You can work with them on this, and have some other support. So
yeah, EMDR I think has such great success rates and makes a lot of allows a lot of people to really move forward and gives you something tangible to do. And I saw someone ask, what's my name on Clubhouse? Just Kelley Gunter, KelleyGunter is my name on Clubhouse. We're just getting started on Clubhouse. It's something really new to me. And like I said, I do it with Dr. Nina for binge-free, for the binge-free babes, and we do it for how to diet without dieting. I mean, get rid of dieting, but I'm getting ready to start trauma talks next week and sexual abuse survivor talks. And so, and how that relates, because I think Tammy said something really, really powerful and important is part of healing from trauma is grieving too, because we have, and that was one of the last things that I really worked on super, and it caught me off guard. And that's what I like people to know is, I have a master's degree in counseling. I was a therapist for 28 years, but things still, that's how trauma works. It's just like the silent assassin. And even though we know a lot of things, we don't recognize it in ourselves. And I had to grieve the childhood I never had. I had to grieve the innocence that was lost. I had to grieve the little girl who wasn't protected. And I had to go through that. And recognizing that, I was a grief therapist for 5 years at a hospice in the beginning of my career. And so I didn't even recognize that I had to grieve, and grief is something that doesn't dissipate at all on its own. It's like fog, it'll hang there and wait forever until you work through it. And also, like you said, Tammy, we just have a world full of the walking wounded, people who have chosen to just never deal with their issues. And so anybody who's watching this, anybody who's listening, you're here. And you're doing more than half the world is. And like, I just applaud you, because it's hard work, and not giving up and not just saying, I'll deal with it this way. It says something about who you are.
So somebody kindly put in eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. You would think I would remember that after all this, but the website to find an EMDR trained therapist is emdria.org, I think, but EMDRIA is the organization. And I know in psychology today, you can find, people that do that too. Somatic experience is another one. And you mentioned grief again, and I share often with partners too, and really it's both parties, but partners in particular, there's a huge grief. There's a loss of the relationship you thought you had. So like the person that shared 30 years of thinking I had this relationship, with this person who's standing by my side, who's my partner and all that, even if there might have been some warning signs, but, obviously addicts are so good at going, no, so you're now all of a sudden when things are discovered, it's like, I have to grieve the loss of this relationship that I thought I had. I have to grieve the loss of the partner that I thought I had. And that's very difficult. And like you also said, there are so many people that in our world that are telling us, get over it. The wrenching of clothes, that would be super helpful. In our society, we don't even, I know in like a Jewish custom, I think I know this is like, you sit, Shiva, I'm saying this all wrong. I have a thick Midwest accent. So the point is that, people take a pause and actually grieve, rather than just going off to the funeral home, doing the, the hour thing. And then now it's all supposed to be behind you. We don't process well,
Right.
in our society. So.
So Clubhouse is not a secure platform for survivors or addicts, in my opinion. They record all conversations. Like I said, I'm new to Clubhouse, and I don't trust anything on social media that is not being recorded or somehow in some way. So that could so be possible. I always assume anything that's done on social media, the entire world can see. So, you know, we speak openly, and someone else just said they record. Oh, yeah. So I agree with Paul that absolutely, if you're going to participate in those platforms, you know, that it's not confidential. So no one can say, you know, oh, this is confidential. Whatever you say stays here. Like it's social media. So in no way can we guarantee anonymity or confidentiality. But it's a platform you can listen on, and you know, it's just listening. So yeah, I think that people who want to jump in, we've had people from all over the world, people jump in from Italy and Denmark and everywhere, and going through the same stuff we're going through in the United States,
Yeah.
you know.
And it probably helps that it's not video. So, I mean, but you know, I always think, like you say, be cautious about what you share. You know, on these platforms,
Right.
you can type something as anonymous attendee. So,
Right.
And with everything, take what you need and leave the rest. So,
Right.
Like just listen in.
Not everybody wants their story shared from Maine to Spain. You know, I'm like, tell it all. I mean, because that's my purpose in life, I feel like. But I understand that so many people in recovery and so many people who are trying to get there do not. And so absolutely, like, you know, anonymity is so crucial for so many people.
So, and we continue to create more resources on sexandrelationshiphealing.com. So please continue to join those. And I mentioned intherooms.com multiple times. So Dr. David does a group for chemsex. It's, I think, the only one. I don't know of others in the world. So that's for co-occurring sex and chemical addiction on Tuesday nights. And then Dr. Rob has been for like 4 years doing sex, love, and addiction on Friday nights. So join those platforms. Super Saturday Recovery Summit coming up again. So and next week, Kristen Snowden is the guest for, or the host for the Wednesday group. So keep coming back. So, and Kelley will be back in April, but she'll have enjoyed her birthday before then.
Yes,
So.
and Albert's birthday. It's on the same day, by the way. How about
so
that?
fun.
I was born on my hero's birthday, and I didn't
so
even know it until 2 years ago. 2 years ago. I mean, I idolized him my whole life, and then my son says to me one day, "Did you know today's Albert Einstein's birthday?" And you know, I was like, "What?" So I also shared up here my Instagram account, because that's where I announce everything. So for the people who were asking what my Clubhouse account was, I also put in my Instagram account name, that if you follow me on Instagram, absolutely, I announce everything on there, and all kinds of different webinars and lives and whatever. So, you know, I think we just stand stronger when we stand together, and we have to keep helping each other and supporting each other and getting useful information out there, because we all deserve to heal.
I agree. It's critical. So thank you, Kelley. Thank you all for joining us. Great questions. Appreciate it. See you next time.
Bye.